I really don't know how to start this one. Um, Mostly because of the fact that Grave of the Fireflies is one of the Miyazaki movies that is very, very, very much based in real life and real events that happened. It's not the only one, but it's like the first one, and it's one of the ones that really, really doesn't pull many punches. Um, So today I will be talking about Grave of the Fireflies, which came out in 1988. It was, as I said, it was made alongside My Neighbor Totoro because they had wanted to make My Neighbor Totoro, but they couldn't get the backing for it. They were able to get the backing for Grave of the Fireflies, and they pitched it as a double feature. So Grave of the Fireflies and My Neighbor Totoro were being made at the same time. And these are two movies that depict sibling relationships in a very real way, but with very different circumstances going on around them, and in a very dark world when it comes to Grave of the Fireflies, and a much more innocent world with My Neighbor Totoro. Not that there aren't innocent elements that happen in Grave of the Fireflies, and not that there aren't dark elements that pop up a bit in My Neighbor Totoro. And even down the line, we get kind of like another side of the story to a degree that happens when we get The Wind Rises. It's another Miyazaki movie that very much focuses around World War II. And I think even The Boy and the Heron, that's the newest one that's out, also I think has some World War II focus in it. And so, I mean, there are so many different stories that came out of that war. Lots of things changed in the world during that war, some for the better, some for the worse, depending on which side of it you were on. I have family connections that go back to World War II. My grandfather on my mom's side was in one of the ships in the Pacific during World War II. He was a gunman there. Him and my grandmother met because of World War II. And all of that stuff. So, you know, there's good parts of, you know, reasons that I exist that came out of it. He came back safely and everything. Well, there are thousands that did not come back safely from either theater, from any of the war-torn areas throughout World War II. And there are lots of civilians, unfortunately, that died during these whole conflicts as well, or as a result of these conflicts, which is where Grave of the Fireflies comes into play. So Grave of the Fireflies is based off of a autobiographical novel of the same name by Akiyuki Nosaka. I apologize if I mispronounced it. And it was originally published in 1967. And then, as I said, later on, Miyazaki wanted to make it into a movie. And it was a story that the author wrote that is, as I said, it's semi-autobiographical, so parts of it are based off of his real life, off of real events that happened to him, which I'll go over a bit more at the end of the story, or at the end of the video. But the movie itself centers around two siblings, Seita and Setsuko. And Seita is, I believe, supposed to be about 14 years old. Here he's the older brother. And then Setsuko is the 4-year-old daughter. The 4-year-old little sister. And one of the things that I found about the movie that was a quote that was about the movie from Roger Ebert, who is this very, acclaimed movie reviewer and everything like that. And he made the comment that very much like Schindler's List, that it is the most profoundly human animated film I've ever seen. I think there's also another quote from him or from someone else that's like, it's one of the best anti-war movies that has ever been put to screen, animated or not. And given things that are depicted throughout this movie, it is very much understandable where the compassion comes from for these characters and why it is a very good anti-war film. Part of the problem is that, unfortunately, we still have war in the world today. So you can publish as many anti-war films as you want, but unless the right people get the message, war is still going to happen. There's places around the world right now that is happening right now. Sudan, Ukraine, other areas all around the world where there that are war-torn countries right now to varying degrees. But you know, so there's a lot that goes into this, and this is a very human film. And as I said, it doesn't really pull many punches. There's very little that is left out of what would have been the experience that, you know, Setsuko and Seita would have gone through during this time frame, particularly Seita, because he would have a much more understanding of what's going on. And so we get a lot of that throughout the movie, and that just adds to it. I have never read Grave of the Fireflies, so I do not know how exactly they interpreted everything, but I do believe that the author of the book very much liked how they interpreted the movie, or how they interpreted his work into the movie. I don't think I found anything that indicated that he didn't like it, so I could be wrong on that, but don't quote me there. And one other thing I wanted to point out before I get into the actual story of it is that a few years ago, or recently, there was a thing that went around on Twitter that was showing this version of the poster that is Seita and Setsuko sitting, and it looks like there's all of these fireflies raining down on them. And then if you adjust the contrast, the brightness in it way up, you see in the background a B-29 bomber plane in the sky. And it looks like that plane is what is raining down the lights. And that it's not fireflies, it's explosives. And it's like, that's been there the whole time. They just adjusted the contrast in what the picture looked like. And that just shows, again, how endearing this movie can be. And in all honesty, I would be perfectly fine if this was a movie that they wanted to show in school to help teach kids about what happened during World War II. Not just entirely from the Japanese side, but to give them a better idea of it, because that is part of what this movie and what the book itself was supposed to illustrate, is that illustrate, yes, is that while yes, the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, had killed thousands of Americans and other troops that were fighting in the Pacific, and yes, they invaded other countries during this time frame to impose their regime and everything like that. There were also the citizens back home who were just like us, wanting our family to come home safe, wanting them to succeed because it was their country's pride on the line. And that is one of the things that this movie goes over a lot, is pride, is how far your pride is willing to push you and how much you're willing to eventually let your pride go and what that can cost you. Because throughout the movie, we see Satan make decisions based upon his own pride. And we see how that can work out in some ways and how it backfires in some ways. So into the actual story. So the movie itself begins with the line, September 21st, 1945. That was the night I died. For context of this, World War II technically officially ended on September 2nd, 1945. So this is about, almost 3 weeks later that this is happening, after the end of World War II. And it starts off with this, where we see this, subway station, and we see this boy who is very clearly very emaciated, torn, ripped up clothing, very dirty, very skinny, just leaning against this pole in the subway sitting and leaning against this pole and just looking, for all intents and purposes, dead, because that's pretty much what he's going to be very soon. And we see all these people just walking around him. We see a few others in other, young kids that are in the same position. And, you know, he's mostly ignored, or just like snide comments are made about the fact that he's laying there, and everything. And, you know, it, I'm not trying to smile or laugh about it, because it's not a funny thing or anything along those lines. And for as much as atrocities can be committed against your enemy during war, there are similar atrocities that can be committed against your own people during war. I mean, even look at, certain German militaries during the same time frame. They committed, horrible acts of violence and war against their own citizens, in order to keep them in line. Other countries throughout history have done the same thing, and there's always going to be casualties in war back in the homeland that were not people who signed up for it, that were not people who signed up to be in the military. But we see this boy, and his name is Seta, and we see him die, and we see what is essentially his spirit watching this happen. And the spirit looks much healthier. And the boy gets looked over, or the dead body now gets looked over by the custodial staff, and they find this, tin, and they throw the tin away. And out of the tin, there just appeared to be junk in the tin, but it's not junk. And we see this, what is essentially the soul or the spirit of this little girl, Setsuko. And she comes out of, she pops up where the tin was, and then the tin is made whole and new. And it's meant to be this like candy thing. It's like fruit drops, or candy drops is what they're called, throughout the course of the movie. And they are, this a bit of a symbolism throughout the movie. They keep this tin with them, this brother and sister, throughout the course of the movie. And we see the two of them much healthier now, and they seem to be going off, and they seem to get on this train, and they're riding this train, and Setsuko seems to be watching as things are happening. And then we cut to where the story kind of actually begins, which is several months earlier, it's during a bombing of a certain coastal town area in the earlier part of 1945. This whole movie takes place within, I think, supposed to be like less than 6 months, I think. Possibly less than 4 or 5 months, depending on stuff, but it's a very short amount of time that the movie actually takes place over. But we are a bit more introduced to Setsuko and Seta, and we are introduced to this town, and the town is about to be bombed by an American bomber plane. And we actually have a place not too far from here, between Lincoln and Omaha, that is a strategic air and space museum where they have different types of bomber planes. I don't know if the American B-29 bomber is there, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. It would surprise me if it wasn't there, in all honesty. If they didn't have, a version of it there. So I could have very easily have walked by and or touched a plane that had been in a similar situation to where they are bombing these areas. But Setsuko and Seta and their mother are getting ready to go to the shelter, and Seta is actually burying a bunch of supplies, a bunch of food and stuff, so that way even if stuff burns down, they can still try to get back to the supplies, and they can use the food later. Hi Brenda, I love you. And what ends up happening is Seta and Setsuko kind of get separated from their mother. They're supposed to meet up at the bomb shelter, at the firehouse shelter. And while they're on their way there, Seta and Setsuko end up in a different area, and we see all of these, bombs, flare bombs, whatever they're called, falling from the sky. Incendiary bombs is the correct term, I think. Falling from the sky, and they start lighting just the entire town on fire. Which lots of Japanese towns at that point in time were made mostly out of wood, because that was a very good construction material that they had at the time. Since then, I do believe that they've had much better quality buildings built in these similar areas that are much more resistant to fire and stuff, and resistant to earthquakes and stuff like that as well. for different things that Japan has had to deal with over the centuries in certain areas. Hi, you're okay. You can lay down. She's like, you talk about sad thing. You pet me, make you feel better. I appreciate that, baby. Oh. And what ends up happening is Seta and Setsuko. Sorry, I'm probably going to mix that up a lot throughout the video. My apologies. They end up, after everything has been bombed and the village is burned down, they end up having to make their way to the school, to the elementary school, which is probably one of the only more reinforced buildings in the area. And they find out that their mother has been injured, and Seta goes and checks on her. And she was either very badly hit by part of the incendiary bombs, or she was caught up in the fire itself or something. But she is just like burned head to toe, almost unrecognizable, still somehow barely holding on to being alive, and just covered in bandages. And she unfortunately does not end up lasting very much longer after that, but Seta cannot bring himself to tell his sister that their mother is that badly injured. And, is that she's this bad and everything like that. So what happens is they end up going to their aunt's house that I think is supposed to be like their father's sister or something like that. We find out that their father is actually in the Navy and is part of the Japanese Navy at that point in time, because the aunt kind of makes these somewhat snide comments about the fact of like, your father's in the military, so you had a truck help you move over here and everything. And so they have some other stuff that happened to survive the fire bombing and everything like that taken there. And she takes them in. And Seta also goes back and he gets a bunch of the different food stuff that he had saved beforehand, that's like different preserved foods and stuff like that, and actually brings it back to his aunt's house where him and Setsuko are staying. And he also ends up, he goes back to the school very shortly after, when everything else is still happening, and it's revealed that his mother does die from her injuries and everything like that. I was like, she was still alive. That's still saying something. And she ends up, along with a whole bunch of others, because at that point in time, having the dead bodies around means that they start carrying infections and diseases and stuff like that. And, bugs start inhabiting them, maggots and stuff. And they need to get them out of the way. So they end up getting cremated very quickly. And Seta takes the ashes home, and he does not tell his sister. He keeps kind of somewhat lying to her, saying, he's doing it for technically what he feels is her own good, because he doesn't think she needs to know that their mother has passed. And this thing that Setsuko has is she has like the little coin purse that she carries with her or wears around her neck all the time, that has all of these little buttons and some little money and some treasures and stuff like that she keeps in there for herself, that are like her little treasures and stuff like that. Like kids, how kids have little treasures that mean a lot to them. So she keeps that with her at all times, and Seta gave her their mother's ring that she keeps in there as well. So she has that to have a piece of their mother with her at all times. And for a little while, it seems like things might be slightly okay with them staying with their aunt. She ends up, again, making the comment about all the food that Seta brings back, because she's like, oh, well, it's really hard to get rations like this stuff. And, those who are, family members of people in the Navy have, get a little more rations than everybody else, or this food is really hard to come across. And she keeps making these somewhat snide comments. We also see that there is a boarder staying with their aunt that is this, military man, and then her own daughter that is there. And, so she's helping, with taking care of them and, keeping, everybody in the house fed and everything like that. And we see these things where she keeps, she'll scrape food out of the bottom of stuff and eat that and do all this other stuff. She seems to be somewhat, I wouldn't call her 100% neglectful of Seita and Setsuko right away, but it does very much start to become very apparent in how she ends up treating them. One of the things that happens is, while she will make food for all of them, she gives Seita and Setsuko the less good parts of the food. Like, she will make sure that the gentleman that's staying with them and her own daughter get rice much more often than Seita and Setsuko do, and get more nourishing and, you know, hearty parts of the meal for themselves, or for herself and the other two adults, more than she will let Seita and Setsuko have it. Even though it's like Setsuko and Seita were the ones that brought the food in the first place. Brought a bunch of that food in the first place. And even while all that's happening, we have this other moment where, like, Seita and Setsuko go outside and they end up interacting with, you know, some of the different fireflies and talking and everything. And Seita keeps trying to send, you know, letters to their father to tell him what's going on, to tell them that their mother has passed away and everything like that. And he's trying to use some of the money from their mother's account to be able to buy food at times. One of the other things that the aunt does is she ends up convincing Seita that they need to sell Seita's mother's kimonos and stuff, because it's like, if we sell this stuff or if we trade this stuff, then we can get more rice and then we can have more food to eat. Which, I mean, by a technicality, I understand the fact that, like, their mother does not need the kimonos anymore, but it's also a very crass thing coming from the aunt. But she also makes the comment that she sold off a bunch of her own stuff to be able to get more food and more rice and stuff like that as well. So it's like, you know, one other, you know, which one you get to trade and stuff like that. You know, I think it is a little bit of her trying to, like, guilt Seita into it. And Setsuko is very unhappy about this whole thing about, you know, them about trying to sell their mother's, you know, kimonos and everything like that, because she has not been told that their mother has died, or she has not figured it out. Or even if she does realize it by that point, it's like giving up that stuff kind of just makes it more of a real thing that's happened, that, like, their mother really is gone and she's not going to need the kimonos anymore. And so we see Setsuko get very upset about that. But they are able to end up getting a lot of rice for it, and that is very helpful. Unfortunately, again, we see that the aunt keeps keeping the better amount of the food and making sure that her and the other two adults get it, stating that, well, that man's protecting our country and my daughter's, you know, doing other stuff to help protect the country and everything like that. Well, you just lays around here all day long. It's like, okay, first of all, Seita points out the fact that it's like, well, the mill that they had me working in got burned down, so I can't go there. And the school that I go to is burned down, so I can't go there. And it's like, are you going to be taking care of, you know, Setsuko this whole time? If Seita does have to go and work somewhere or go to school or whatever, are you going to watch Setsuko this entire time? You don't seem to be very useful about taking very good care of her thus at this point in time anyway, considering the fact that you keep somewhat ignoring her, giving her less good food and different things like that. You know, simply because she's a child or because she's not your child. And eventually the aunt basically ends up not being very happy. Again, she becomes very reproachful of Seita, because he eats so much, but he doesn't take care of so many things around the house and everything like that, even though, like, he's trying to help to a degree what he can do at that point in time. She keeps making comments about, well, have you gotten in touch with your mother's family? And he's like, well, I don't know how to get in contact with them. I don't know how to find them. And eventually she makes the comment, because, like, Seita and Setsuko are getting tired of eating just nothing but rice porridge, while the rest of the adults, the aunt and the boarder and the daughter, end up having, you know, much better food. So she's like, how about this? We each make our own food from now on. And Seita goes and he gets a bunch of money out of their mother's account, and he ends up buying a bunch of, you know, dishes and cooking supplies and food and, stuff like that that he can use to then make food for him and Setsuko. And, so we get that. But then on top of that, even though they are doing that now, he is able to help make food for them and everything like that. And like they have some of their own rice that the aunt gave them that had come from them anyway. It's like, well, it was their mother's kimonos, so it should be their rice to begin with. And even the military guy makes a couple of snide comments at times. I don't remember if the aunt's daughter, so like Setsuko and Seita's cousin, I don't know if she makes any comments or anything like that. I know she buys Setsuko new shoes, but I don't know if she makes any snide comments about the kids or not. I'm not sure. I don't remember that. She doesn't talk very much throughout the course of the movie. But what ends up happening is, the aunt ends up kind of, yelling at them because, there's different air raids that keep happening. So they have to keep going and being in the shelters and everything like that, and she makes snide comments about like, well, you're old enough now to go and help fight the fires. So why don't you go and do that instead of, hiding out in the shelter, in the air raid shelter and everything like that. And, but the thing is that by technicality, Setsuko is the only family that Seita has left, and he wants to do everything he can to protect her as much as possible. I mean, to a degree, yes, I can understand where the aunt is coming from, but it's also like, okay, you don't seem to be paying that much attention to her to begin with. You don't seem to be doing that much to show that you'll take good care of her. And if you showed that you would take good care of her, then I'm sure that Seita would be much more willing to go and want to help fight the fires or help do other stuff because he knows that Setsuko would be taken care of. But that's not the case. That's not what is indicated by the aunt at this point in time. Because while Setsuko may not quite notice that the aunt isn't being quite as fair as she should be, Setsuko or Seita kind of does, and that's why eventually they end up actually leaving the house. They leave their aunt's house because she keeps making all of these comments about like, well, why don't you just go and live in the shelter or whatever at this point in time? And that's what they do. Seita and Setsuko end up moving down to the air raid shelter, kind of an abandoned air raid shelter area. And what ends up happening is there's also this kind of little flashback that happens at one point in time when it comes to like where the kimonos are involved, where Seita and Setsuko go to the beach and they end up running around and having some fun there. And we kind of start to notice these different rashes start to appear on Setsuko. And Seita is, of course, doing what he can to help take care of her. And he has, as they're like playing on the beach, they end up finding a dead body on the beach. So that's clearly someone that has passed away due to various reasons. And he tries to keep Setsuko away from that. And while they're on the beach, he ends up having a flashback where he remembers, when him and his mother and Setsuko would be having fun at the beach and seeing his mother in the beautiful kimono and everything like that they had to sell, that they would sell later on. And, her having food, making food for them and just, treating them very well and very lovingly and everything. And then we have this other memory that is the four of them, the three of them, and then their father, the husband there as well, having their picture taken with all of them in very nice clothing and everything. The picture probably would have been taken probably shortly before the war started or shortly after it started, depending on stuff. So we get to see this, representation of like this very happy family and everything. And, that makes Seita, kind of sad that they did have to sell the kimonos to get rice, but it's like, okay, we have rice now. And, as I said, they move down to the shelter and they start, they kind of end up, they get food from a local farmer that is, willing to sell it to them or trade it to them. And they end up, kind of foraging for what they can within the area by the shelter, which is this, there's a lake there and there's, other forest area that they can use for like scavenging for firewood and for other things like that are edible. Well, firewood is not edible, but additional things that are edible. And throughout this whole time frame, they have the little candy drops that they end up, the fruit drops that they end up, sharing with each other throughout this course of time, which is kind of nice. There's even an adorable thing that Seta does where when they're almost out, he fills the whole thing with water, closes the can, and has Setsuko shake it all up so that way they can, dissolve the fruit candy, and then he pours it out and lets her drink it, and it tastes really good. So it's just like this little treat, and then they hold on to the tin because it's a representation of just something that meant a lot to them, something that brought them comfort at times. And as we go through the story, we keep having these moments where we see the soul versions of Seta and Setsuko kind of watch what keeps happening, like them on this train, seeing Setsuko or seeing Seta holding their mother's ashes. We see this other stuff where they're watching as as they had to move to their aunt's house, how they had to do all this other stuff, how they kept moving from different place to place and everything like that, other like shifts within their life, and like the soul version of Seta is watching this as it happens, and such, as he still takes care of Setsuko, the little Setsuko spirit. And the night that they're at the shelter for the first time, what ends up happening is Setsuko ends up kind of not being happy because it's really dark out and really dark in the place where they live. One of the other things that previously had happened was that because children have night terrors. I am aware of this when it comes to kids having night terrors, or kids that will just cry in the middle of the night just because like they need comfort. Something is not right. Setsuko misses their mother, and she would keep crying at night, and the aunt would make very snide comments again about like, if you can't make her stop crying, then at least take her outside so we can all sleep as well, and everything like that. And so so Seta, that eventually that is one of the things that leads to them leaving. And what ends up happening is, of course, I think it is one of their first nights in the shelter, once they're moved in there after they've had their really good meal and everything like that. What Seta and Setsuko ends up doing is they end up gathering up all of these different fireflies, and they release them into the shelter area, which they have like mosquito netting around to keep the mosquitoes out, but also now the fireflies can't get out. And they release them and everything, and they watch as all the fireflies glowing and flashing around them and everything like that. And Seta ends up telling Setsuko about the fact that when he before Setsuko was born, he went to like a naval review. And so it's just like all of these lights and displaying all of the pride of Japan with their battleships, and all the people waving flags and cheering, and bands playing like the national anthem of Japan, which I don't know what it is, and everything like that. And just like kind of that pride from that pride that you tend to have in your country, that gets that most people are raised to have this pride in your country. And Setsuko and Seta are no different. Setsuko or Seta very much wants their father to win, and everything like that, so he can come home and be safe and take care of them and everything like that, which we still haven't heard anything from them. Still haven't heard anything from the father at that point in time. And the next morning, Seta wakes up and he finds that Setsuko is digging a hole. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And she goes, "I'm making a grave." And Setsuko very innocently replies that she's making a grave for the fireflies, because she's like, "Well, mommy's in a grave now too. Auntie told me." And, Setsuko ends up, she picks up the fireflies and she drops them in the grave. And Seta has this flashback because he had been there when they had cremated his mother, where they just kind of dropped her into a pit with a bunch of others and then burned them all together and then gave them the ashes. And Seta starts crying as Setsuko has like buried the fireflies and everything like that. And we kind of pan over through the shelter where we see that there is still the box that contains their mother's ashes. And it's kind of like glowing at that point in time. I mean, it's not glowing in reality, but it's glowing to indicate that like their mother's spirit is either still there or is getting ready to pass on now that both children can kind of possibly have the ability to let her go. However you want to put that. And Seita just cries and everything, and this, prompts Setsuko to want to go and visit their mother. And so he's like, I'll take you to come and see our mother. We'll go to her grave and everything. We'll go visit the grave one day. And then we have it be that throughout all this whole time frame, Seita and Setsuko have been, there's dwindling amounts of food. It's harder for them to get a hold of rations. It's harder for them to get a hold of, pretty much anything, since they are kind of outside the system at this point in time. And even the farmer that had been giving them food is like, I can't do that anymore because we have to keep track of everything when it comes to rations and when it comes to other stuff. And, so I can't do that anymore. And there's this other moment where like a bunch of young boys find their way down to like by where the shelter is, and they see that, oh, there's someone living here, and like they kind of mess with some of the stuff that's there. And Setsuko had made this much more of a little bit of a grave for the Fireflies, which is of course where the title comes from, with burying the Fireflies and putting little offerings of food and putting flowers inside of the candy drops, the fruit drops tin and everything. And the boys are somewhat disrespectful to what's everything there, and then they run off. And Seita ends up getting to the point where he realizes that he does need to start actually stealing food because Setsuko is getting weaker and weaker and skinnier and having diarrhea and other types of health issues and everything like that. And he ends up trying to steal, food to help his sister, but that doesn't work. And, that doesn't end up working very well because he ends up getting caught by one of the farmers who ends up kind of beating him up and taking him into the police. The police kind of seems to be somewhat on Seita's side because he, kind of like, admonishes the farmer. It's like, you've already beaten this cut up enough to the point where I might call it assault. And, that makes the farmer leave. And Setsuko, or Seita, or the police officer kind of talks to Seita a little bit. And he mentions that one of the other villages, or one of the other towns or something like that, ended up being bombed. I don't remember if... I don't think it was Nagasaki or Hiroshima. I don't think that was what they said. I probably would have remembered that. I don't remember the exact dates for everything, for what happened with Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I have seen Oppenheimer at this point in time, but I don't remember the date. That was for when the bombs were dropped. Horrific action that was taken, yes. And that is not downplayed in that movie. Again, that's another movie that to a degree doesn't always pull punches about what ended up happening to where the bombs ended up. Doesn't pull, all the punches with that either. But what ends up happening is, Seita kind of gets, he ends up taking Setsuko to the doctor, and the doctor looks her over and he explains that she is very malnourished and everything. And, she needs food and everything like that. And Seita is like, well, where am I supposed to get food at this point in time? There's nothing else that I can do. And one of the things that he resorts to is actually going and trying to steal stuff while their bombing raids are going on. He goes into people's houses and he tries to steal food, and he tries to steal kimonos and other things like that he can take that then he can try to sell to get, food and stuff like that. Trade for food and everything and stuff. So he tries to do that to try to get so that way he can have food for Seita or for Setsuko. And there's this one moment where they come across a guy who's sawing ice away so that way he can take the ice into someone's house for their ice box. and they end up eating like the ice shavings that are on the ground because they're so hungry and so thirsty. And I mean, the human body can only take so much time without proper water and without proper food and nutrition. I think it's like 3 days for water, and it's like what, a week or something like that with no food, that the human body starts to have those issues where, you know, there's only so much, you know, reserves within the human body that can be used up before it gets to the point where there's nothing else for the body to use to eat anymore. And, you know, Setsuko is this 4-year-old girl who, you know, hasn't been getting the proper nutrition for quite a while. Part of that is because of their aunt. Part of that is, even though Seita is trying to do everything he can to get her the proper nutrition as much as he can, it's not working very well. And at one point he's even told by the farmer, you know, just, you know, swallow your pride and go back to that woman. Go back to your aunt and just try to get, you know, try to have her take you back in. And Seita doesn't want to let go of his pride because it's like, well, she wasn't treating us very well to begin with. And it's like, why would I want to go back to her and risk her treating us worse? And everything. So we get some of that. And eventually what ends up happening is Seita goes and he ends up getting a bunch of the money from their mother's account. And he ends up buying this whole, you know, large amount of food. And while he's doing this, while he's at the bank, he ends up finding out that the war is over because Japan surrendered unconditionally. So yes, that would have been after everything that happened with Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I am aware of that, but I don't remember exactly when that happened, when the bombs were dropped. That's the part that I probably should have looked up, but I don't remember what that was. But the thing is that Seita has been somewhat out of the loop as to everything that's been going on because he's not reading the newspaper or able to listen to the news on like a radio or anything like that. He hasn't gotten anything from their father. He ends up asking about the Navy, and they're like, all the Navy is like at the bottom of the ocean, so it's just like their dad's dead too. And now they are officially orphans at that point in time. And yes, as is what happens a lot of time in war, is that there are lots of children who end up being orphaned. Some end up getting taken in by other family members or by family friends to be taken care of. Others get taken to orphanages and possibly adopted. And as is what is shown very well here with Seita and Setsuko, is that they end up living on the streets. And they're definitely not the only ones that do so. Unfortunately. And you know, that is a very real aspect of war in general, even if you're on the home front. You know, I'm sure, you know, it's like had my grandfather not returned from World War II, I would not exist. My mother would not exist. All of her siblings would not exist. And, you know, my grandmother either would not have ever gotten married again, or she would have, you know, married someone else, and the family would have been very different. For reference, I never got to meet my grandfather on my mother's side. He died about 30 years before I was born, from that were probably some side complications of stuff that happened during World War II, injuries or stuff like that he sustained, because I do think he got shrapnel in him at some point in time. He has a Purple Heart. I have seen that. But so there's a lot of stuff that goes into that when it comes to, you know, parts of, you know, the home front is also where people suffer when it comes to war, and that is another thing that this movie is trying to depict. And Seita makes his way back to where Setsuko is at the place where they live, and he finds, you know, Setsuko has, you know, fainted at some point in time while everything's been going on, and now she is just, you know, he has her in the shelter and he's trying to do what he can to take care of her. And she is kind of hallucinating at this point in time from you know, hunger and everything like that, and malnourishment. And she's actually sucking on one of like the marble things, thinking that it's one of the fruit drops, and he has to take that away from her. And he, you know, she's like, I made you these rice balls, and they're like 2 rocks that she puts in front of him. And he's gotten a watermelon, and he's gotten eggs, and he's gotten rice, and he's gotten a whole bunch of stuff that he can use to try to make her really good food. And he gives her watermelon, and he tries, but she falls asleep and she never wakes up again. As he said, she fell asleep and she never woke up again. And we see that, what would be like that night where he is holding her, and, at the very least, even if she's not 100% gone at that point in time, he at least wants to give her comfort as much as he can before she is fully gone. And he ends up, it's not an easy thing to watch by anything, obviously, by any measure. But what ends up happening is, she passes. And I mean, Seta is suffering from malnourishment as well, but he's a little bit more able to, his body is older and it's more able to endure stuff better than like a 4-year-old's body. And Seta ends up getting, coal and a coffin that he can, burn Setsuko in and everything, so he can cremate her himself. And he puts her doll in the coffin with her and her little bag of treasures and everything. He doesn't put in the fruit drops thing. He keeps that with him. And he burns her, and it's like, I burned her, and then I never returned, I never returned to the shelter after that. I just left. And he ends up, then we cut back to, present day, where he just, eventually ends up, he puts her ashes in the fruit tin before he leaves, and he carries that with their father's photograph until his death, at the train station where the movie starts. And he ends up, then we cut to where we have, the present day thing where it's Setsuko and Seta's spirits, and they're both, they're in death. They are reunited, and they've gone through this journey of like rewatching their past and everything. And they are now sitting on this bench with fireflies flying around them peacefully while they look over the modern version of the city, the skyscrapers and everything like that, Japan has been built back up again. And so we see that depicted as like the last bit of the movie. In regards to the cast of the movie, I don't think there's really any major names in the movie itself. The version that I have seen and that I'm going off of is the 1998 version that was dubbed into English, is the one that I have. And then there was another one that they did that was dubbed in 2012 that I have not seen, but I don't necessarily think they probably would have changed too much of it. This is one of the ones that was not redubbed by Disney, as opposed to like, most of the other Miyazaki movies that had been released up to the point that Spirited Away came out, and a few after Spirited Away. This was one of the ones that was not dubbed by Disney, or did not get a redub by Disney. And there is also I think it was 2005 live action version of Grave of the Fireflies that was made as well. That is, that has been, subsequently released. In regards to the author and his connections to the story, as I said, it is a semi-autobiographical movie or book that was written by Nosaka Akiyuki. And he was born in 1930. And his biography is that his mother died shortly after his birth, and that he was then adopted by his aunt, who, as far as he knew, was his mother, who he believed she was his mother, because his biological father didn't really want anything to do with him, and, remarried and, had a different family. And, which, again, is stuff that happens, unfortunately. When the war came, what ended up happening is eventually, it is based around this similar bombing event that was the bombing of Kobe, which is one of the different towns within Japan around the coastline Don't ask me exactly where it is. I don't know. But it was bombed on June 5th, 1945. So June, July, August, September. So about 4 months is when this time frame of the movie takes place, or so, because it's supposed to be that same bombing that this is referring to, where where his adopted father and mother are killed, or his mother is badly injured, and Nasako runs away with Kiko, who is his infant sister, who he believes is his sister. And unlike in the movie and such, he and the adults around him fail to care adequately for her, and she died in August. Subsequently, he did end up moving to Japan, where he ended up eventually getting into like juvenile detention for stealing, and then he is eventually found by his actual father, and they reconnect, and then he's reclaimed and taken care of by his actual father. Nosaka, I apologize if I've mispronounced his name. I apologize. He ended up writing this book as a way of apologizing for his sister's death, for the fact that he could not take care of her. And he even states that Seite's death in the opening is seen to be seen by the author as suicide. And his journey to the film is his personal hell until he reaches heaven. That is what is stated to be his opinion of what happens in the story, which is fair. And as I said, it's one of those movies that it is a very good depiction, a very real depiction of what happens during war. And should I ever find out that like a child of mine, or like my niece or nephew or whatever, ended up watching this movie in history class for learning about World War II, I would be perfectly okay with that, because it does depict a real thing that happened to probably lots and lots of people, lots and lots of children who went through similar situations in this regard. So that's what I wanted to do there. This is probably one of the more emotional ones that comes out of the Ghibli movies, but it is a story that I am very glad that they told. As sad as it is one that deserves to be told, because again, it's real things that happen to real people. I'm literally almost done. So that's what I have there for Grave of the Fireflies. The next one up, we're back to kind of happy again, or a bit more happy and whimsical. And that will be Kiki's Delivery Service will be next. So yeah, it goes from like Totoro, where it's like very happy with a few sad stuff in it, or like the thing where May goes missing, and then it's like, and Grave of the Fireflies, and back up to Kiki. It's like, okay. Not that other Ghibli movies don't have moments where they go over like real world issues that have been happening, and as I said, later on we're going to get The Wind Rises, which is another side of the same story that happens during World War II. In that story, and I think the boy in the Heron also has World War II time frame as well. I think. Don't quote me on that. I have not seen it yet, but it's one of the Miyazaki movies that very much, this Grave of the Fireflies is one of the ones that it's very much based in reality, as opposed to like Nausicaa or Castle in the Sky, where it's like, this is a fantastical science fiction type world, or even, Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke, where there's magic everywhere that is involved in this world. This is a very real life situation. And The Wind Rises also does that, and so does From Up on Poppy Hill is another one that is like this very real depiction of real life, for the way that can work. And it's different sides of this similar story, or of similar stories that are real life sides of things. So that's what I have. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the movie, or I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you have not seen this movie, please go watch it. I kind of wish you would watch it before you watch this, because I cannot do this movie justice. I cannot do a review of any of these movies justice. But that's what I have. So I thank you for watching, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye.